and I will end full pair.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show. Me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched the last episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Very, very much appreciated. Apologies for not doing an episode of the show last week, but I was away visiting partner Lucinda's family, so that wasn't able to do so. But anyway, going back to the last episode of the show, the West Midlands inaugural release episode, had a lovely email from Jordan, who was quite happy with my review of his whiskey, and basically said I was right in my assumption with regards to the matriarch. He indeed did blend that bottling first, and then whatever was left over was bottled as the individual casks. So I did ask whether, you know, a core kind of blended sort of West Midlands bottling is on the cards, and although it's not been ruled out for the time being, I think he's just basically going to sort of like, you know, play around with the single cask stuff, and mentioned there are some interesting casks that he's got up his sleeve for bottling in due course, and I think there's even a peated malt that will be released towards the end of the year, I think. So worth keeping an eye out on West Midlands Distillery. If you managed to get hold of a bottle from the inaugural release, then hopefully you enjoyed that. If you didn't, then hopefully you'll get something in the future. Anyway, so moving on to today's episode of the show, as you can see from the title page, I'm looking at the High West Distillery in Utah. It's not the first time I've done an episode of the show on Utah, but these samples were kindly given to me by Helen from Marussia Beverages 2 years ago possibly. So thank you for that, Helen, and apologies that it's taken so long to do an episode of the show. But like I said, it's not the first time I had done an episode of the show on High West. I did one years ago, forget when. Certainly the first time I came across High West was 2012, when they were first sort of imported into the UK by, then the company was Eau de Vie. And I remember thinking at the time, Utah was a bit of a funny old place for a distillery. I mean, you know, Utah is synonymous obviously with the Mormon sect, and although I don't believe it's a dry state, and I don't think they're entirely anti-alcohol. They certainly are not. They don't kind of, you know, run it up the flagpole, so to speak. And certainly from the foundations of Utah, which I believe was in 1847, certainly when Brigham Young took his followers there, he certainly didn't encourage the consumption of alcohol. And obviously Salt Lake City, Utah has kind of developed over the years. Apparently it was a staging post for prospectors heading west to California during the gold rush. There was also silver discovered in some of the mountains around sort of Utah, which then led to a sort of an influx of miners and what have you at the time. And I guess that sort of the powers that be were quite pragmatic with regards to alcohol. They realised that obviously, you know, you couldn't sort of have miners and prospectors coming into the city and not expect them to want to have a drink or two or three or maybe more, I suppose, and spend their hard-earned, as they say. And so yeah, a bit of an odd place, you think, really, to build a distillery, but apparently in 2006 that's exactly what former biochemist David Perkins and his wife Jane decided to do. Apparently they planned to move to Utah because David was into his skiing, and apparently Utah or Salt Lake City is kind of a ski city. Not that I ever knew that, but then I don't really know a huge amount about the states, it has to be said. But the interesting thing was that that apparently David was, so I read in an interview, not really that into whiskey. I mean, he enjoyed having a drink, but wasn't an aficionado, and just had a bottle on his shelf every now and again, you know, as a lot of people do. But apparently, I think it was during a visit to, I think it was Maker's Mark, that he started to think, you know, I can make whiskey. I mean, you know, distilling whiskey is no different to distilling ethanol for the bio industry. And apart from the fact that, you know, distilling whiskey is a bit more fun and tastes a lot nicer than bloody ethanol, I would imagine, as well, and going to kill you. So, you know, again, an odd thing to do, but he purchased an old livery stable in a garage on Park Street and set about turning that into the first High West distillery. Subsequently, they've obviously expanded because, I mean, High West has now grown into a very well respected distillery and a respected brand, I suppose, for want of a better word. And certainly it got to the point where they moved to a larger distillery, or opened a larger distillery in a place called One Ship in Utah, which is apparently around about 25 minutes drive from the original Park Street distillery. And then eventually the distillery came to the attention of the big boys and was purchased in 2016 by Constellation Brands. Now, another interesting thing about the distillery was that when David sort of founded the distillery, he was told basically, well, you're going to have to make some money. You know, you can't just sort of rely on. I mean, they had an on-site restaurant and they were making a vodka, but you know that was not going to sort of pay all the bills. So he was advised to buy bulk spirit and bottle it as his own, under his own label. And you know, this is not something unheard of. I mean, it happens all the time. It's just a lot of places, although they're opaque basically, and this is what upsets a lot of people, you know, and certainly in Ireland it just seems to be a huge issue. You have these new brands and distilleries popping up, and you know full well that what they're bottling isn't their own juice. But so in this instance, David was kind of like, you know, very aware of this fact, even back in 2006 or 2009, 7, I think it 7 or 9, one of the two, when they first started releasing, and so he wanted to be upfront and basically said, look, you know, we're getting our stuff from Indiana distillers. And what was interesting, that instead of just sort of like buying the bulk spirit and bottling it and going, yeah, there you go, he decided that it would be fun to just blend some stuff together, and he was again advised to sort of buy rye, because rye was dirt cheap, because nobody was really interested in it back then. So that's a bit of a gamble, it has to be said. And so he was sourcing these ryes from Indiana distillers owned by MGP, and obviously in America nobody seems to have an issue with sort of like, you know, buying spirit from MGP, and I guess that's mainly because sort of, you know, it's not like, you know, the Irish distillers sort of buying from, you know, the limited distilleries that they can buy from. MGP is a huge distillery, huge organisation, makes no end of different mash bills and stuff, you know. They probably even tailor the stuff and produce it specifically for you. So it's not like MGP has a specific style and you'd go, oh yeah, I can taste that comes from MGP. But anyway, so the whole idea was that certainly when I first tasted them back in 2012, even though the distillery had been going for about 5 years, everything was still sourced, although the plans were, from what I was led to believe, that eventually some of the sourced spirit from MGP would be replaced by spirit distilled at High West, and that is indeed now the case. So mash bills and the blend has changed over the years, and certainly I would imagine that they're not using some of the aged stock that they were doing back in the day. And although I don't, all these samples are relatively modern, except the Campfire, and you're probably wondering why I've got 2 Campfire bottles on the title page, and that's because I have a current, or relatively current sample, and I have an older sample from 2016 which has a slightly different mash bill, so it's going to be really interesting. I've not tasted these two side by side, so I'm really intrigued to find out if there's a really big difference between the two. But obviously we'll have to wait until we get to the end to discover that one. But yeah, so I thought that might be a little bit of fun to do at the end of the show. So not a huge amount to basically say other than what I've said already, so let's take a look at today's lineup.
Inside, but now
Right, I'm going to kick off with the double rye. This is bottled at 46%. Originally this was all MGP spirit. It was basically a 16-year-old rye blended with a 2-year-old rye. I believe the 16-year-old rye was a slightly different mash bill to what it is currently, and it was 53% rye and 37% corn. Current mash bill is column still spirit from MGP, 95% rye and 5% malted barley, but it now includes High West distilled, pot still distilled rye. And the interesting thing about this is it's 80% rye and 20% malted rye, no barley whatsoever, which is intriguing. I know that the barley, more often than not, was not really there to add a great deal other than to sort of like help kickstart the fermentation. So it'll be interesting to see what that one's like. Second bottling is what was their very first bottling, and what they, I guess, are still calling their flagship bottling, the Rendezvous rye. This pretty much features exactly the same mash bill as the double rye, as in 95% rye from MGP and 80% rye from High West, although apparently it has a larger proportion of High West distilled spirit in these days. In originally, again, it was sort of this blend of 95% rye with a 53% rye mash bill. Third bottling we're looking at is their Bourbon, which is now just called a Bourbon, where in the past it was called the Prairie Reserve Bourbon. It seems to have dropped that Prairie Reserve bit. I have absolutely no idea. This is all source spirit, and it's quite a surprise actually, because I would have thought that by now, it's obviously the distilleries decided they weren't going to distill a bourbon, they were just going to distill a rye. So it's why it's all sourced now. So you've basically got a straight bourbon from MGP, which is 75% corn, 21% rye and 4% malted barley, with an undisclosed 84% corn mash. Now I believe when this was very first released, the Bourbon was not only sourced from MGP, but I believe Four Roses, I think. Whether it still comes from Four Roses, I couldn't say, but they, for contractual reasons, apparently they don't state where it comes from, so not particularly a little bit of opacity there, I suppose. And then we're going to come to the two Campfire bottlings. Like I said, new bottling, or relatively recent current bottling and older bottling. So the current bottling again is the 95% column still rye from MGP, with a straight 75% bourbon, 75% corn bourbon, 21% rye from MGP, with some of the High West Distillery's pot still 80% rye. And as you probably know or may not know, the folklore that's built up around about this particular bottling is that when David and his wife were on holiday in Islay, they had a dessert that was made from, was drizzled with honey, and a syrup that was made from a reduction of a peated whiskey, and basically they loved it and thought, you know, they could replicate that kind of character, obviously using the bourbon to sort of like, you know, give it the fatness, and obviously the peated blended malt component, obviously adding the peat. Now the older bottling, now this one comes from 2016 when I reviewed it for the whiskey magazine, was actually slightly simpler in that it all came from MGP. It was possibly a 5-year-old plus straight rye of 95% rye, and a 5-year-old or minimum 5-year-old bourbon, which was slightly different in that it was 75% corn, 20% rye, and it just says peated whiskies. I don't know whether it was a peated blend, probably. Whether it was any different to what is being used today, of course I couldn't say, but obviously there is going to be, well, I'm hoping that there's an obvious difference in the fact that now the current bottling has some of the High West's own pot still rye in it, so yeah, really looking forward to that. Anyway, getting a bit dry because I've been talking for far too long, and I think you want me to taste some whiskies. Well, I want to taste some whiskies, so I'm going to do so.
Say me I love you so much. Say.
Right, okay, so let's kick off with the double rye. Let's see what the nose gives on this one, shall we? It's a nice nose. First thing you notice straight off the bat, not a huge amount of oak. I mean, it's very subtle. I mean, it's got subtle vanilla, and it really allows the rye to shine. It's got plenty of that sort of column still, high-toned rye, that sort of dried, sort of sultanery kind of column still character. There's a slight nuttiness, and then beneath that there's a sort of like slightly more weightier spirit. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't realise with regards to American distilleries, so they're a little bit like rum distilleries in that they often have both column stills and pot stills in the same distillery and then blend the two distillates together. Nice spiciness, bit of ginger, citrus, a little bit more oak coming through as it kind of sits in the glass, but I love that kind of freshness of character, but it has that kind of like weight and sort of density beneath that, and it's just a lovely nose, it has to be said. See what the pass like. Oh, that's fresh. That's got some intensity, it has to be said. I mean, that's got some youth, but not too much. I'm not getting a lot of that kind of rose petally sort of young spirit character, but it has some lovely intensity. It's obviously 46% non-chill filtered, as it should be, and again it opens up with a lot of the column still spirit. It's got that sort of high tone, sort of sultanery dried fruit and spice. And then it does darken as the sort of the pot still element kind of comes through on the mid palate. A little bit of herbal rye coming through as well. A little bit more vanilla, but again, you know, we're not talking huge first fill American oak vanillins. It's very subtle, and it's allowing the sort of like the rye to sort of like, you know, to shine through. Slightly bittering on the finish, a little bit of sort of dark rye bread. I like that. I think that's a really, really impressive whiskey. Okay, so let's move on to the Rendezvous rye. So let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Right, well, I mean, straight off the bat, a lot richer, a lot denser. It's certainly displaying a lot more pot still character. It's got that, like I said, that weight. It's got quite a woodiness as well, darker, orange, menthol, cinnamon, a little bit of cocoa as well. I mean, that's a lovely nose, that has to be said. Again, like the double oak, there's not a lot of oak character, not a lot of vanilla, no real toffee or anything like that. So again, we've got purity of spirit character. It is beautifully balanced, and like I said, it has a lot more weight to it. A lot more intensity, less of the column still notes, it has to be said. Does it feel a little older? I'm not getting any real sort of difference in age. Again, it's got some maturity. I don't get that kind of youthful rose petal character, and it's just wonderfully mellow. It's just a lovely, lovely nose. Let's do a pass on. Again, rich, full. It does show a bit more maturity than the double rye. It's certainly not as fresh and as zippy and as nippy, but that might be more down to more column still, more pot still spirit and less column still spirit. Touch more oak, a little bit more vanilla. It's got a lovely creamy, coffeed, slightly toffeed finish, so that, and a little bit of cinnamon coming through as well. It's certainly kind of, again, lovely emphasis on the rye spirit, with the sort of like the oak really only kind of coming through on the finish. That's just a lovely whiskey, it has to be said. Really very, very impressive. Okay, so now let's move on to the bourbon. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? A little reserved, quite youthful, dense, oily, corn fat, very oily in actual fact, a little biscuity note, tobacco, vanilla. Again, not a huge amount of oak, although obviously the bourbon component will have had to have been aged in virgin American oak, obviously. But it's not overly oaky. It's quite a surprise. It's sort of, it kind of reminds me to a certain extent of something like Knob Creek, although it's not so spicy as Knob Creek. But Knob Creek doesn't have an awful lot of oak either, and you sort of like think, well, you know, where's the first fill on that, or the virgin oak on that? And it's but anyway, kind of coming back to this, it's got quite an oiliness. It's got a reserved. It's not quite as intense as I remember it, to be honest with you. It's a little bit. It's nice, but yeah, it's not. Anyway, let's sort of pass on. Again, it's quite oily, earthy, not getting a lot of that corn fatness that I often get with bourbons. It's quite minerally, it's quite a little bit citric, some spices coming through as well. There's a little bit of drying, kind of dusty, tannic rye kind of coming through. It's got a nice length to it. I don't think it's as impressive a bottling as the two rye bottlings. It's a good bourbon, it's a pleasant bourbon, but it's kind of, yeah, it just doesn't quite have the intensity of the rye, it has to be said, but you know, still not too shabby.
Oh, save me, I love
Okay, so on to the first of the two Campfire bottlings. So this is the current release, which obviously has some of the High West Distillery's pot still rye. It's again a little bit on the reserved side, dusty, earthy peat. The rye is quite subtle. It's certainly playing second fiddle to the peat, it has to be said, and it's got the weight. I'm getting the sort of the pot still weighty rye character, a little bit of the sort of high tone dried fruits, burnt wood, touch of corn, violets, ginger. Oh, I mean, that's a lovely nose. I mean, it's more heavier on the peat than I remember, but we'll find out when I get to the other one. I remember it being a little bit more bourbony and less peated in the past. I mean, it's a lovely nose, it has to be said. I mean, I love the nose. I mean, it's got the sweetness and the richness beneath the peat. A little bit of dark chocolate. Yeah, let's do a pass on. that's how I remember it. A lot more bourbon character to start off with. Oily corn, toffee, and then in comes the peat. It's got a slightly more medicinally kind of note. I'm certainly getting iodine and medicinal peat notes. It's certainly lingering. It kind of kicks in around about sort of the mid palate and sort of lingers and carries on. There's a touch of honey, some salt, ginger, tobacco, a little bit of chocolate. I mean, that's a lovely whiskey, it has to be said. It is just so unusual. It's just, like I said, the nose is a lot more sort of peat led. The palate certainly a lot more bourbon and a lot more how I remember it. And certainly I love the way that the sort of like the peat kind of comes on the mid palate and just sort of like that kind of carries on and lingers through. But I mean that is a fantastic whiskey. Okay, so on to the final bottling of the afternoon. This is the 2016 bottled Campfire whiskey. Let's see what the nose gives on this then, shall we? Now that's a lot more reserved and a lot more oily and a little bit more oaky, a little bit more toffee and coffee and charred oak. I mean the peat is there, but it's not as medicinal. It's kind of quite thick and kind of oily and intense. Touch of herbs. It's got a lightness to it. It certainly doesn't kind of quite have the weight. No, it certainly doesn't have the weight of the current bottling. It's a lot more linear to a certain extent. But I love the freshness to it. It has to be said. It's got more of a freshness, and like I said, it's got more bourbon character, more and less peat. But certainly the peat is there, and it's a lot more kind of earthier and sootier and drier and not as medicinal. Let's see what the parts are. A lot more bourbony, a lot more sweeter, a lot more oaky, a lot more vanilla, a lot more fat corn. Again, the peat is very subtle, or subtler than it is on the current release. It's smokier, it's less medicinal. So there's obviously a difference now in the peat, the peated malts that they are using, I would suggest. A little bit of meatiness as well, bitter chocolate, again some coffee, cinnamon, tar. I mean, it's interesting because it's not quite so sort of like the current bottling, like I said, kicks off with the bourbon, in comes the peat, and that kind of lingers through. This is possibly slightly more harmonious. The older bottling, it's a little bit less sort of like bang bang bang. It's a little bit more sort of like it sort of kicks off with everything there, if you like, and just opens up and unwinds. It's different. Whether one is better than the other, of course, is very subjective. And I like both of them in their own way. I like the sort of the harmony of the older bottling, and the fact that it is more kind of bourbony and less about the peat. The peat is kind of more constrained. I guess on the current bottling, it's maybe a little bit too peated, if you like, and it's kind of again maybe moving away slightly from the original raison d'etre, I suppose, for the bottling, and then these things kind of happen, I suppose, and it's just really intriguing to sort of see that, because you know, unless you have this opportunity, most people will buy a bottle 1 year, probably buy a bottle in about 2 or 3 years time, and probably won't remember what the original bottling was like, and both of them are really good, but they are quite different. So yeah. Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, firstly, a big thank you again to Helen from Airship Beverages for the samples for today's episode of the show. I thought it's been quite fun. It's been a while since I've delved into High West, and although it may well no longer be sort of like the small independent distillery that it once was, it's still producing, you know, really high quality spirit. The double rye, yeah, I kind of quite like that. It had plenty of that sort of high tone column still kind of character. It was quite herbal. I liked the balance of it. You had an obvious kind of like core of that sort of pot still weighty rye character, and I thought that worked really nicely. The Rendezvous rye did exactly what it was supposed to do. It showcased more of the High West pot still character. It was a more denser, it was a lot more richer, possibly slightly older, but I still certainly don't think that there's a 16, that either of those two bottlings has any 16-year-old spirit in there. I mean, certainly nowadays, no chance. I mean, you know, back in 2006, you know, nobody was buying rye. You could probably pick up that kind of aged rye for, you know, pennies. Nowadays, you know, everybody wants old rye, and yeah, you ain't going to get that. So I think sort of different to how it was originally, but still, you know, really stunning bottlings. The Bourbon, you know, I get the problem is that sort of when you have a distillery that sets the bar really high, anything that just comes slightly lower than that, and the Bourbon is not a bad Bourbon, but it's not the rise. It doesn't have the quality of the rise. It doesn't have the intensity. It's a nice Bourbon, but it's just, you know, it's okay. It's nice. The Campfire whiskey, like I said, the current bottling is quite heavily peated, or quite peat orientated, possibly a little bit too peat orientated, certainly on the nose. But then this is the point, isn't it? You know, this is where we're at in 2025. People love peated malts, peated whiskies, you know, and you know, everybody's going gung-ho for this kind of like heavily peated stuff, when the reality is that sort of, you know, certainly with Highland and Speyside distilleries, although yes, historically they would have used peat, but they wouldn't have been peated to anywhere near the 40 odd or 50 parts per million that a lot of them are chucking out these days. And so it's kind of like yeah, it is what it is, I suppose. And to a certain extent, the older bottling, the 2016 bottling, sort of showcases almost the original thinking of the Campfire, the fact that it was showcasing the fact that it was an American whiskey with this kind of, you know, touch of smokiness, touch of peatiness. It wasn't about all the peat. It was more about the Bourbon and the rye, and it was possibly, one could argue, slightly more harmonious back in the day, you know. But in saying that, I love the progression of the current bottling. I love the way on the palate that it opened up with the Bourbon and the oak, and then in came the peat, and that kind of like lingered through. So I think both of them have their kind of their plus points, shall we say, and you know, unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, the current bottling is the current bottling, and still don't think it's a bad whiskey at all. So, but you know, that's been a whole lot of fun. I mean, and like I said, it's not something that I get the opportunity to do very often, but yeah, really enjoyed that. Anyway, that's this week's episode of The Show in the Bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and like I said, I think High West is a distillery that's, you know, if you love your American whiskies, you know, don't overlook them, even if it is in Utah. Anyway, until next week, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to be doing next week, but it's going to be good anyway. So anyway, until then, good afternoon and good dramming.
You're